Thank you, Lauren. It's lovely to be here and have an excuse to talk about my very favourite record series, which is the Census. We all use the census when we're researching our families in England and Wales, and a whole lot more besides. Um, and although I've been doing family history for nearly 30 years, and I've been looking at the census one way and another, what seems like every day of those nearly 30 years, I never tire of it. There is always something new to find. We go there looking for people, looking for their names, their ages, their dates of birth, or at least their approximate ages, and we look at it to find out about their families, and then we go on to the next thing and we get birth, marriage and death certificates, and we look at other records. But there is so much in the census that's not just the bare bones about the person you're looking for. There's always something new to find. There's always something to see when you look around, and you'll see not just the person that you're interested in, but where they lived and the sort of place they lived in, who they lived with, or who they were with on census night. Because it's worth remembering that although we talk about this is where somebody lived in the census, it's a bit like a big game of musical chairs. It's where everybody was standing when the music stopped. So it might be somebody's regular home address, or they might just be passing through. They might be visiting. It's a snapshot once every 10 years of where people happen to be. Now, as I said, there is so much more in it than just seeing where somebody was and how old they were, and possibly a bit about their family if they were with their family. You can find out an awful lot about the place that somebody lived in. For example, if you just look at the rest of the page that somebody's on, you can see who else is there. Depending on the census year, you might find out a bit more about the kind of buildings. Later censuses tell you how many windows there were, or how many inhabited rooms there were. So it does tell you a bit about the buildings, and also about who was nearby. You can find out that way, perhaps if somebody lived next to a slaughterhouse or a pub. So there's an awful lot that you can see, not just the names. Now, one of the reasons that the census is my favourite record is because it's one of the very few records that you find in family history research where you see people in whole groups, usually family groups, but it could be any kind. And there aren't many records that link so many people in a family. The other ones that you're likely to find are possibly wills, where somebody might very kindly list all their children and their grandchildren and who they're leaving stuff to. And sometimes you'll be very lucky and you'll find a gravestone inscription that mentions several members of the family. But not everybody has a nice gravestone, and not everybody leaves a will or is mentioned in a will. But in theory, at least, everybody should be in the census. Now, that isn't always the case, but most of the time, that's what you'll find. It doesn't matter whether you were the Queen in Buckingham Palace or whether you were an orphan in a workhouse. In theory, at least, you get your single line in the census. It's also worth remembering that the census was taken for reasons that were nothing to do with entertaining, amusing and educating family historians in the 21st century. We're the incidental beneficiaries of these records, but the census was taken for a whole lot of other reasons. Put most simply, it was to find out exactly how many people there were in the country. And the census has been taken every 10 years in England and Wales, and also in Scotland, from 1801. Now, the first census that's really useful and has information that we can make use of is 1841. There were censuses taken before then, but the 1841 is the first time that all the names were gathered together centrally. Prior to that, a person taking the census details in their town or village would probably list all the names, but those lists of names were very rarely kept. When they were kept at local level. So there are some returns around for 1801, 1811, 1821 and 1831. But once the statistics have been gathered, and that was really the point, how many people are there, and what are they doing. Once that was done, the lists of names weren't regarded as being of any importance. So if they survive, it's accidental. 1841, though, and what you can see now is a page from 1841. Unusually, it's a page from an original. It's not exactly what you'd call full-on Technicolor, but you can see that that's a picture of an actual page, not the stark black and white images that you're used to seeing. You will see a very few like that when you're looking online, because some of the original filmed images weren't very good quality, and sometimes they've gone back and been scanned from the originals, so you'll get a colour page, or sometimes a whole set of colour pages. So I thought I'd show you one of those, so you get a better idea of what the original paper books looked like, which you don't get to see these days, because if everybody handled them who wanted to look at the census information, they would have been worn away to a pile of greasy dust long ago. So we have to make do with the online images, which in turn usually come from films. So this is the 1841 census, and it's the first one that's really useful. What I'm going to be talking about is the census for England and Wales, and also for the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, and in some census years, some shipping and army and navy returns. This varies a bit from year to year. The census was also taken in virtually identical format in Scotland, but at the National Archives, we don't have those records. Those are held in Scotland by the National Records. So if you want to look at those, you have to go to Edinburgh and look at them, or you can go to the Scotland's People website. Either way, you'll see the same thing on a screen. But if you're looking for someone in Scotland, we haven't got them, but we have got the whole of the rest of Great Britain, plus Channel Islands and the Isle of Man, which are grouped together with England and Wales for census purposes only. Ireland is different again. Census there was taken slightly differently, and the census returns that survive, and unfortunately a lot don't, they are held by the National Archives of Ireland. So I'm talking here about the 1841 to 1911 censuses for England, Wales, Channel Islands and the Isle of Man. And that's because, first of all, the census was taken every 10 years, but because the information in it is personal, it's got people's names and ages and relationships within families, these records are closed for 100 years. So 1911 is the most recent one we can look at, and the 1921 census will be released in January 2022. So you've only got a bit less than 5 years to wait before you see that. Now 1841 was a big improvement on anything that had been before, because the records were all kept, but it doesn't have as much information as you will get in later census years. I mentioned that everybody's got a line, but the lines here are quite small. There are 2 pages in one shot, so you can see that all you'll get is someone's name, you'll get an age, and unfortunately ages of adults, that's anyone over 15, are supposedly given in full, but rounded down by 5 years, or at least they were supposed to be. Sometimes you do get someone's actual age, which may or may not be accurate. Children's ages are supposedly more accurate, but always take ages in census with a pinch of salt, because it's only as good as the information that was available to whoever was filling in the household form, and they may not have known everybody's age exactly. So sometimes you'll be sitting looking at somebody's birth certificate, and you'll see that in the census their age seems to be completely at variance with that. Well, this happens because the person filling in the form may not have had a pile of birth certificates to look at. It's very easy to forget that this is just something that happened once every 10 years. Some government official would come and stick a form through your door, and you would have to fill it in. And you probably weren't thinking about your ancestors 150, couple of hundred years on, and what they might make of what you'd written. So it's always bearing in mind. In fact, that's true of virtually any record that we use. Try and think of Why was somebody bothering to collect this information, and what was going on when that information was written down? Some people took more care of it than others. You know, that just happens. It's just your bad luck if, like mine, your ancestors weren't very good at paperwork. So that's a bit about the 1841 census. And then if you, as we go on, I'm not going to show you a page from every single census year. I've jumped forward a bit. This is a bit from 1861, and this is more typical of the sort of thing that you will see. And then another 20 years on, 1881. There are small differences in the layout of the forms, and there are very small differences in the questions. But essentially, you don't get an awful lot of change between 1851 and 1901. There are small differences, but you get substantially the same sort of information. And that information from 1851 onwards includes a lot more than you got before. You get the name of every person as before, and you will get something like their exact age, again, what's supposed to be an exact age. But as well as those details, you will get more about their relationships within a family. You will see someone, and it's usually a man, who is the head of the household, and everyone else in the household should be described in relation to him. So with your typical nuclear family, this will be a man who's the head, and then there'll be his wife and his children. There might be stepchildren, there might be in-laws, and there might be servants or visitors. But everybody should be described in relation to the head of the household. And then you'll get some people's marital status, which in the early censuses is going to be married, unmarried, or single. From 1891 on, it was single rather than unmarried. And that was a good thing, because when it's written very quickly, the abbreviation UNM for unmarried can look very, very similar to MAR for married. So the fact that they changed that to S for single in 1891 does make life a little bit easier for people trying to read this stuff. You get people's occupations, and then you also get their place of birth. Now in 1841, you just get a tick box to say whether someone was born in the same county where they were in the 1841 census. And if they were born in another county, you just know that it wasn't that county, but it doesn't give you any clue as to what county it might have been. And if someone was born outside England and Wales, you will get just a brief indication of whether it was S for Scotland, I for Ireland, or P for foreign parts. A bit helpful, but not very helpful. From 1851 onwards, though, you will get, at least in theory, a more precise place of birth. For birthplaces within England and Wales, you should get a parish and a county. Sometimes that's not terribly helpful, as in London, Middlesex, but it's still an improvement on what went before. If someone was from outside England and Wales, all that was required was the country they came from, but occasionally, if you're lucky, you will get a bit more information. Now, I mentioned that the information in the census with regard to age was only as good as the person giving the information. Sometimes people weren't terribly good at working out what the instructions were, even though they had instructions to follow. And sometimes what's in the census may be very clear and easy to read, but it might be nonsense. And there's an example of it on this page, right at the bottom here. This is 1881. There is a household of 3 people, and the head of the household is Emma Weston, and she's a widow, and she's 36. And then the next person is Sarah Ann Parkinson, whose surname is spelt wrongly, and she is described as mother, and she's 25. Well, if she's the mother of Emma Weston, she can't be 25. And if she's 25, she can't be Emma Weston's mother. So there's something weird going on here. And then the third person, whose name looks like B-R-E-A-T-E-S. Her name is actually Beatrice, but I only know that because I've done a lot of research on this family. And she is described as granddaughter. Well, it is technically possible that she could be Emma Weston's granddaughter because she is 2, and Emma Weston is 36. It's pushing it a bit, but biologically plausible. But plainly somebody has made a mistake here. Either the enumerator, copying all this stuff into the enumeration book, which is what you see here, or one of these people, one of these two women who was filling in the household schedule in the first place. I happen to know, just in case anyone cares, that Emma Weston and Sarah Parkinson, they're two widows and they were sisters. Quite how they managed to make such a mess of the census form, I don't know, but you'll notice that they're in Maidstone, and in Maidstone there used to be literally a pub on virtually every corner. That's all I'm saying. But it's a good example of how you can't always believe the information that's in the census. And because what you see in most census years is not what the family members wrote down for themselves, it's what was copied later. So an enumerator, like this one here, might have quite nice clear handwriting that you can read perfectly, but you don't know what they were copying from, and it may have been something absolutely horrible. There's an example again. I've jumped forward another 20 years. And this is 1901, but you can see it's very, very similar in format to the earlier census years. There are a couple of other questions. I'm not going to go into those in a lot of detail because we've got all that information on our guide on census records, which you can find on the National Archives website. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. I just wanted to give you a general overview of the census and what you'll find in it and some of the things that you can do with it. Now that's 1901, which you might well be familiar with, but then when we go on a bit further, I will show you the 1911 census, which is very different in format. But before I do that, I just want to stop and look at something that you will see in all the census years, and that's quite easy to overlook. And that is at the beginning of each enumeration book, there should be a description of the area that's being covered. Now, sometimes it will be very unhelpful. It will just be the whole of the parish of, and leave it at that. But in some cases, particularly in towns, you will get a breakdown of not just the boundaries, but you may get a list of the streets. And sometimes you will get a lot of detail about precisely what the enumerator's route was. Now I'm teasing you here a bit because what I'm showing you is a fairly unusual one. It's one of those very rare ones where there is actually a little sketch map. You hardly ever see those, but it's so very nice when you do. I just thought I'd include that as an example. And even when there isn't a map, it's worth thinking about a map because the way that the enumerator would have gone round their particular district is what you might call a sort of postman's round. So you won't necessarily find all the dwellings in one street altogether, because if you had to deliver hundreds of household schedules to all these addresses in a fairly short space of time, and then go round afterwards and collect them, the logical thing to do would be to go along a street, and then down a side street, back up the other side of that side street, and back onto the main road again, and so on for any other side streets. So if you try and think about the way that an enumerator may have physically gone around their own patch, it can help you make a little bit of sense of how the streets and the addresses and the people appear, because this was somebody on the ground wearing out their own shoe leather and using up their own time to get all these things delivered and collected. So when you do see a map, it's a nice visual reminder that that is what they did. Now, on to 1911, which you've probably looked at, and you'll see this is quite different from the other census years, and this is because this census was taken in a very different way. The initial stages were just the same as they had always been before. Contrary to what some people will tell you, in every census year it was up to the householders to fill in their own census papers and then hand them to the enumerator when he came round, and it was always a he until 1891, when women were first allowed to be enumerators. Now obviously in the early years a lot of people couldn't read and write, or they couldn't do it terribly well, but the enumerators might have helped a few people out with filling in their forms, but they simply didn't have the time to do it for every family or every household. They were not paid very much for this job, and sometimes you'll see snarky little comments from enumerators in the margins of the books saying what a horrible job it was and how they wouldn't have done it if they knew they were going to get paid so little for so much work. So the enumerators didn't go and stand on the doorstep and ask all these questions. They collected the papers, and if they weren't filled in by the householder, they might well have been filled in by a friend or a neighbour who could read and write. Again, that's something that's worth bearing in mind. If you're asking a neighbour or perhaps a local shopkeeper to come and fill in your form for you, you might not give them the unvarnished truth about ages and relationships within the family. Again, it all goes down to what was going on in the room at the time when that information was being written down, who was asking the questions and who was doing the writing. In 1911, it's much more obvious that this was what was going on, because for the first time, the enumerators didn't take all these schedules home and copy them up into enumeration books. They had to collect them all and pass them on up through the hierarchy, through the local registrars and superintendent registrars, who then passed them all on to the central census office in London. But the whole object of the census, if we remember back to what I said before, well, it was a big statistical exercise. And to do the number crunching, they had previously used absolutely enormous and increasingly large spreadsheets. And they had got to the point where you couldn't record any more information practically on paper because people didn't have arms that were long enough. If you see some of these sample sheets, they are absolutely huge. And it reached really the limits of that sort of paper-based technology. But in 1890, the American census had used tabulating machines to do all their number crunching mechanically. And the British census authorities thought that this was well worth looking into. And this is in fact what happened in 1911, that instead of copying everything up into books, which were then used to record information about age and occupations and birthplaces and so on, the number crunching was done directly from the household schedules. And they did it onto computer punch cards. We've got some samples of those, and they are exactly the same as the computer punch cards that people who's worked with these things in the 1970s and thereabouts will be very familiar with. The size of a dollar bill with a small cut-off on the corner. And this punch card technology was first used in the British census in 1911. So the enumerators kept all these household schedules, and then we get to see our own ancestors' actual handwriting, however beautiful or however utterly horrible it might be. But at least it's straight from the horse's mouth. It hasn't gone through a copying stage. There's one other incidental little detail about 1911, which is that it's the only census that I am aware of anywhere in the world that records exact birthplaces for people born in Ireland. The Irish census doesn't do that. That just asks for a county of birth. And all the previous censuses just asked if somebody was born in Scotland or Ireland, just to put Scotland or Ireland. But for the first time, the 1911 census asked for exact birthplaces, that is parish and county, if the person was born within the British Isles. So that's a nice little bonus there. And there is, on this page, there is actually an Irish servant whose birthplace is given. So that's a nice bonus. To my eternal disappointment, being a Glaswegian, unfortunately, the Scottish 1911 census does not ask for exact birthplaces in Ireland. Oh well, you win some, you lose some. But because the 1911 kept all the household schedules, you get to see some quite unusual things. And this is something which you wouldn't expect to see in the British census. And actually, this is a census schedule filled in German. this isn't quite as odd as it sounds. The reason these things were used was because for certain parts of the population that didn't speak very good English, and this was principally to do with Jewish immigrants in the East End of London and some other major cities, because it was felt it was very important to make sure we got accurate returns from all parts of the population. In these later census years, the schedules were produced in Yiddish and in German so that the householders could use them as an illustration of how they were meant to fill in the English language ones. They weren't meant to fill in the Yiddish or German ones. They were meant to use them as a template. But of course, there's always somebody who doesn't read the instructions properly, even if they are in their own language. And this is one, admittedly, a very, very rare example, that this is one where it was filled in on the German schedule. Incidentally, I am reasonably certain that this was not a Jewish family, because if you look at the occupation, when it's translated into English, it's pork butcher. This is actually from Liverpool, but it's quite interesting to see that these things exist. Also, from the very beginning, there have always been Welsh language schedules for people in Wales who required them. And unlike the Yiddish and German ones, it was absolutely okay to fill those in. So you will see Welsh language ones for some parts of Wales, mainly in the north where there were more native Welsh speakers, but you will see them occasionally, and they were filling in things absolutely correctly. But I'm afraid the German pork butcher and his family only scores 5 out of 10 for reading instructions properly. Now, as well as the household schedules, you get extra documents, and it's worth looking at these because they tell you a bit about the area that you won't see if you just look at the household pages. There is the description of an enumeration district from 1911, and it gives you a nice lot of detail there. It gives one section which is the boundaries, and then below that a list of all the streets that the enumerator went around. That's useful, so you know you can get yourself geographically oriented. But another important page that you should look at is what's called the list. And this is what the enumerator had, just a list of all the addresses, just so they could make sure that they'd delivered a schedule to every address and that they'd completed one afterwards. And all you'll get on there is the address, the name of the head of the household, usually just with initials, and just a summary of the numbers of males and females there. But you will also get information there that you won't get on the household schedules. You get the kind of building it was, whether it's a shop or a private house, and you'd also get information there about uninhabited buildings. So this can give you a lot of context, which in an earlier census year you would see just by looking at the other families on the page. But in 1911, the other families are all on pages of their own. So it's always worth having a look at these enumerator summary books, just to see what the surrounding area looked like. Now, I've shown you household schedules, which you will have already seen for 1911, but this is an example of what was delivered in 1851. Most of these things don't survive because once the enumerator's books were written up and all the statistical abstracting was done, there was no need for them and they were destroyed. But you do get occasional survivals. This is from Newcastle on Tyne in 1851. And what seems to have happened here is that the enumerator ran out of pages in his book and didn't have a spare one, so just kept all the household schedules. So there is a section of Newcastle in 1851 where you will get household schedules. That's the outside of it that's just got the address on it, but it's also got the instructions as to exactly how they were supposed to fill in the form. And on the other side, this is the schedule itself after it's been filled in by the householder. So that's just a nice little reminder that this is what people did in every census year, not just where we can see it. Something else just to spoil your day is, of course, once the census was taken, sometimes you won't find people because bits of it were lost or damaged. I wrote a quite detailed blog post explaining about all the reasons that people might not be in the census and why you might not be able to find them. So I'm not going to talk about that at great length here, but this is just a nice example of how you can, you might not have information. Now, you can see the names here, well, that's fine, so you can see who these people are, but you can't tell where any of them were born. And then if you go on to the other side of the same page, you've got the birthplaces, but you have no idea whose birthplaces they are. So that's just a reminder that although in theory everybody's in the census, sometimes you won't find them because occasionally they were missed out, or sometimes they were in there once, but pages or books have been lost or damaged in the process. This is what, just to finish with, this is what happened once the census was taken and all these, the enumeration books were sent to London. They were dealt with by a whole army of clerks, and we have a number of documents which are called instructions to the clerks, and we have a number of documents which are called instructions to the clerks, and the really useful ones are these ones which deal with occupations. It's called instructions to the clerks, but a better description would be the Registrar General's classification of occupations. And that's what the title page looks like. And then inside, you've got detailed classification by these various areas. They're broken down into orders and suborders and particular industries, and then right down to the minutiae of people's jobs. None of these occupations is actually defined, but sometimes if you can find where something sits in the hierarchy, you can work out what kind of job it was, or at the very least, what sort of industry somebody worked in. And I guarantee if you look at that, you can spend many a happy hour looking through the classified lists and find some weird and wonderful occupations that you've never heard of. It's a nice diversion when you're not finding what you want to in the census records. Some of these things are online. They've been scanned and they're on a website called HistPop, Online Historical Population website. I have created a link to that, so you can, and we link to it from our guide as well. So you can have a look at that, and it gives you lots and lots of background about how the census was taken, if that's the sort of thing that you're interested in. And absolutely finally, I just want to mention something which isn't a census, but it looks a lot like one, and this is the 1939 register. It's not a census because it's not covered by the Census Act of 1920, so it's not subject to the 100-year closure rule that other censuses are. And also it was taken for a very different purpose. The point of a census was to find out about the population as a whole, and the best way of doing that is listing everybody by name so that you get everybody once and you don't get anybody twice. Well, that's the theory. It never quite works, but as a general rule for taking a census, it's pretty good. 1939, although it looks very much like a census, had a different object. The object of it was to list every single person. And although some statistics were gathered from it, the point of it was to list everybody so that they could get a national identity card and then shortly afterwards a ration book. So that's why we're always at pains to say it looks like a census, but it's not a census. But from the genealogist's point of view, it fulfills a lot of the same purposes. We use it to find people. You could get dates of birth in it, which you don't get in any census, you just get ages in there. But it doesn't give you relationships within a household, and it doesn't give you birthplaces. But it's still a very, very interesting document and well worth having a look at. Again, we have a whole guide on that. So if you haven't already had a look at the 1939 register, I'd recommend that you do that. And this will give us all something to look at for the next 5 years while we're waiting for the 1921 census to come out. Thank you very much. Are you sure I want to stop recording?